All right, well, I'm trying a new recording system. Got a new microphone. We're going to see if I can just slowly improve things with the podcast over time. Today, I wanted to talk about one last thing having to do with working in the world. We've been talking about the three spheres of authority. We've got the three spheres of the world: the garden, the land, and the wilderness that God sets up in Eden. And we've talked about the home as a place where people are made, and we'll talk more about that later with the sexual relationship between a husband and wife. But we've talked about the home and how the home is a place of rest. The home is a place of transformation. The home is a place of fruitfulness, spiritual fruitfulness, as well as physical fruitfulness. It's a garden place. It's a place where food is made and eaten and together. And we've talked about the spiritual import of all that. We've talked about work in the world and why God sends us out to the land to bring home resources for the home. But when I want to talk about one more thing and just talk about the difference in the way the ancient world approached work versus in an kind of existential why work exists way, and versus the Christian way to think about it. Because in the ancient world, if you read Hesiod, the ancient Greek world in particular is what I'm going to be talking about. They viewed work as they viewed work a lot different than we do because of the kind of cosmos they believed they lived in. So when the world was created, or the world basically always existed, but then the Titans came along and they began to form it into what it is, and then the gods came along as the children of the Titans, and they were born of the Titans, but then they overthrew the Titans because the Titans kept trying to destroy them, Kronos in particular. And Kronos was the god that ate its own children. Kronos represents time, and time was the great enemy because death was at the end of time for everyone. So Kronos, time, ate all of its children. So you needed to be born in time or of time, but then you were destroyed by time as well. Well, the gods were able to overthrow time. They became eternal. They were the Voldemort of the ancient world, right? They wanted to become eternal. They wanted to never die, overcome death by their own means. And the gods were the beings that did that. Well, then the gods, though, realized that because they were eternal, that they would have to work forever, and work was seen as a curse. It was a slavery to your needs. So you could escape death, but if you couldn't escape work as well, then you were still basically a living slave. And so the gods created men, right, to be their slaves. He created men to work the land for them, to go get them food, to do, right? That was, and so men had to work as because they were enslaved to the gods. Because if they didn't do their work, if they didn't make their sacrifices, then the gods would show up and everything would go wrong. Right? Your bull would get pregnant, or your cow would get pregnant by one of the gods, and a monster would be born. Your daughter might disappear. Your field would go completely barren. Your wife would go barren. Right? If the gods showed up, things went terribly wrong. Well, and this is how it worked: as you worked the land, you went and got the food. You took a portion of the food and a portion of the wine, and you took it to the altar, and you put it on the altar. And that altar was a sort of spiritual portal between Olympus, where the gods lived, and you, right? So there, that little idol was the table in front of the idol was a spiritual portal. So if you put your grapes on it, or your wine on it, or a T-bone on it, that would show up on the table of the god of Olympus that was represented by that idol. So if it was Zeus's idol, it was Zeus's table. You'd put your wine and your meat on it, and then the wine and the meat would show up on Zeus's table, and then Zeus would be busy up there eating and drinking, and then that's why he would leave you alone, right? So your work as slave to the gods was to get them to leave you alone. So there wasn't um, rest for the weary. There wasn't you couldn't just stop. You had to keep working because you were enslaved to the gods who made you. Now the men were starting to get too powerful, and so the gods created woman in order to mess everything up. Right? That's the way the Greeks viewed it. That's the way that's the way the Smurfs viewed it. Right? You've got the Smurf village is working perfectly. Everybody has their job, but then Gargamel comes along and he says, "Oh, we can't have all this peaceful working that men will do. We need to create Smurfette, right, and throw Smurfette into the mix, right? That view uh, is distinctly a Greek view of women, because obviously what the story in the Bible is completely different. God creates Adam, and then he receives Eve as a gift, right? He receives Eve as a helper in the mission that God has given him. But the mission isn't because God has needs. The mission is because we're made in the image of a God who works and rests, right? Who works 6 days and rests. So the Sabbath man wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, right? We are the kind of creature that finds its best fulfillment in labor and rest, in a rhythm of labor and rest. God doesn't need our sacrifices. God doesn't need our tithes, like any of that. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He never sleeps. It isn't asking for sacrifices because he's hungry. The prophets tell us, right? It's because when we tithe, when we bring the Lord some of our increase, we actually discover something about ourselves in terms of the goodness of being better to give than to receive, right? That it's a blessing to be able to take care of one another. It's a blessing to be able to be generous, right? And even in the Levitical sacrificial system, when we were bringing animals as sacrifices, even then the animals weren't because God was hungry, right? The animals were because we wanted to be close to God, right? Because God had rescued us. He had rescued us out of Egypt, and we wanted to be close to him. He was setting it up such so that we could live with him, be near to him, but death was still in the way. Our sin, our guilt, the curses of the Garden of Eden, or being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, were still in the way. But we wanted to be close to God, and so we would bring an animal forward. The animal would represent us. We would lean our hands on the head of the animal 3 times, it tells us in Leviticus, and until there's the identification between us and the animal, and then the animal would die on our behalf, right? Just like the animals that died to make the clothing when they were leaving the Garden of Eden, right? Because this day you will surely die. Well, an animal died in their place, right? That there's a substitutionary sacrifice right out of the gate in the Garden of Eden. Well, in the same sort of way, Leviticus sets up a substitutionary sacrifice so that we can go close to God, so that we can be near to God, right? That to get the death and the sin temporarily out of the way, so that we can be close to God. So whereas the sacrifices of the Greeks and the Romans as well was there to keep the gods at a distance, the sacrifices of Leviticus was so that we could come near to God. So the work was a completely different thing. The sacrificial system was a completely different thing. The gift of women was a completely different thing, right? Adam needed to be able to do his work. Adam needed wisdom that he didn't have, but God hid that wisdom in the gift of Eve, right? God hides the wisdom that we need to be able to do our work well in our wife. If we become the kind of person that can love our wives well, if we become the kind of person where our wives flourish, then what we'll see is that our work flourishes right alongside our wives flourishing, because they're the same kind of thing, right? Loving your wife and caring for her, being the kind of person that she can trust, right, is the same sort of skill set, I guess you'd say, the same sort of virtue set, maybe, that makes somebody good at work or successful at work, that, in a long-term flourishing sort of way. So um, there's a deep relationship between being able to um, being able to be the kind of husband so that your wife can flourish, and being able to be the kind of husbandman of the land where your work can flourish. Right, they're deeply connected. So um, all of that to say, when God gives us work in the Bible, it's because we're the kind of creatures that can find deep satisfaction and fulfillment in work. Right? You don't find deep satisfaction and fulfillment in perpetual vacation. Right? You don't find deep satisfaction and fulfillment there. You do find it in, but you can find it in your labor when you're laboring by faith as unto the Lord, Paul tells us. So a deep difference between that pagan view of work, where it's a slavery to fate, or a slavery to the gods, a slavery to reality, that we have to work even though it would be better if we didn't, versus the blessing of work and the blessing of wives that go deeply together in the Bible. So all right. Well, hopefully this recording system works out, because it actually was quite a bit easier. So if it works out, then yeah, that it'll be really nice. So all right, have a great weekend.